Dobrý deň, milí priatelia, hlásime sa z konferencie Globsec v Prahe. Je 31. augusta. Máme tu významného hostia, ďalšieho. Pán Kurtom Volkerom je okrem mnohých iných vecí bývalý veľvyslanec USA pri NATO a taktiež donedávna špeciálny predstaviteľ USA pre záležitosti Ukrajiny. Tým je téma do značnej miery vymedzená. Mr. Volker, let's start with the overall situation of Ukraine. I mean, how is the war going on? The situation on the battlefield is some sort of a precondition for the further diplomatic negotiations and the outcomes. So what's the situation now, especially for Ukrainian politics and for the civilian population? It seems to be quite dramatic for the last 3 months.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. And I think I've attended every Globsec meeting that has ever taken place. So it's the first time that we're not in Bratislava having this meeting. And it's a shame because it's a great conference. There's great participants. It showcases the country very well. It's a tremendous boost to the Czech Republic right now. And it's sad that we're not in Slovakia as we usually are. As for the situation in Ukraine on the battlefield, we have a situation right now where Vladimir Putin still believes he can outlast Ukraine and outlast the West. He thinks he can eliminate Ukraine as a country, as a nation, a people, an identity. He can change the government in Kyiv. He can get the West to back down. He can rebuild the Russian Empire. So as long as he thinks he can achieve that, he's going to keep going. Therefore, what we have to do is convince him that not only will he never achieve that, but that he will severely damage Russia if he tries, if he keeps it up. He is not convinced of that right now. He wants to see what happens in the US election. He wants to see what the next US president does. Does Western aid to Ukraine continue? How do things go on the battlefield? He's got a lot in play. But I hope that by next year he can see resolve from the West, aid and support from the West, resolve from Ukraine, and battlefield losses. And if he can see that, then maybe there's a chance for actually bringing about peace.
Bringing about peace in what time horizon? It seems that war shall continue for some time so far.
Indeed. I don't see Putin being ready to consider a ceasefire or stopping fighting, at least until the end of next spring. He needs to see how these events play out first. And if we can complicate his life more, the battlefield, maybe sooner, but I'd say the most likely is the middle of next year is just the very beginning of when we can see Russia perhaps being ready for some kind of peace.
Because Putin, in his head, has some sort of a map. And the map is the map of Imperial Russia. Not exactly perhaps Soviet Union, but Imperial Russia from the end of 19th century. Yeah. And Ukraine is an integral part. Mm. This seems to be a hard trouble to resolve because they will try to keep Ukraine, whatever happens.
That's exactly right. So first off, I'm not sure he has a map in mind because his campaign for re-election as president was based on the slogan, Russia has no borders. So he sees everything as fair game.
He said no borders.
No borders. Russia has no borders, meaning he'll take what he can get. He'll take the Baltic states, he'll take part of Poland, he'll take whatever he can get until he's stopped. And what that reflects is exactly what you say. He has an imperialist ideology that he is reestablishing the Russian Empire. He has compared himself to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great on this great quest of acquiring Russian lands. That means he's not going to just walk away. He has to be physically stopped. That's why the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk is actually significant, because now it demonstrates to the Russian people, not only is he not Catherine the Great or Peter the Great, he's the only Russian leader since World War II to actually lose Russian territory. So he looks a lot more like Nicholas II at this point.
At the panel, at a session quite recently, you have said that NATO membership for Ukraine is not something to be merely conditions by the end of the war, but it's part of ending the war, if I heard well. But let's put it more exactly. Did you mean the full membership before the war ends, or full promise, legally binding promise of full membership as part of ending the war, which is not quite the same?
Yeah, I think we have to, so let me be clear. We do currently have the position that Ukraine will be a member of NATO someday. But the assumption is that the war is over, there's a settlement, and then after that there's some kind of process and we eventually get there. What I'm saying is we need to view Ukraine's NATO membership as part of the strategy for ending the war. That we not only help Ukraine with the weapons and the permissions that it needs to push back on Russia to get Russia to want a peace, but then when we have that peace, we are also saying, okay, whatever the settlement is, it is. There is a new border, and the Ukraine that is sovereign and democratic and part of Europe will be immediately a member of NATO. That's part of the deal. That's how you end this for good. As I said, you need to both stop the war, but then you need to have a permanent peace. And a permanent peace comes through deterrence, which comes through NATO membership.
Do we now, at the moment, we are sitting here, have some clear idea of what kind of results the war can bring about, or what kind of scenarios? There can be an optimal scenario, we know what, but perhaps there are some suboptimal scenario. Yeah. If the war is to go on for some time, if the result won't be perfect.
Yeah.
What can we expect?
Yeah, I don't want to speculate about territory, but about society. Ukrainians are determined to defend their country. Doesn't matter if they're a native Russian speaker, native Ukrainian speaker, native Tatar, whatever. They're defending their homeland and they are determined to fight. It is very difficult. They have a smaller population, they have fewer resources, but they are determined to fight. Russia has more people, it has more resources, but they are less motivated, and Putin has been trying to sell this operation, this war, as though it's not a war. Increasingly difficult to do. He has avoided mass mobilizations. The one time he tried it, 1 million people fled the country. He's avoided doing it a second time. There have been at least 300,000 killed and another 300,000 wounded Russian soldiers. You can't hide that in society. So there are going to be stresses in Russian society because of Putin's war. And the question is, how many more soldiers can he call up for what period of time before those stresses are something he has to react to?
I will allow myself to make some sort of provocation now. Okay. So far for the Russian society, for the Ukrainian society, we have been talking about them. But what about the Western societies? Are they strong enough? How long will they endure? And Ukrainians now are fighting for something which has been largely on the left part of the political scale described as atavism, as something nationhood. Nations do not exist, scientifically speaking, etc., etc. Instead of we are talking about the identity politics. Yeah. I'm afraid, isn't there going to be some sort of communication problem, communication breakdown between the youth which is fighting and dying for its national existence and the youth which does not know which one of the tenths of identities to choose?
You make a good point, and there is something to that. Western societies have become incredibly comfortable and are arguing over esoterica in domestic politics in many cases. Ukrainians are in a different place on the Maslowian scale. They are fighting for survival. I think that our leaders in Western countries can understand that. They choose not to want to. But the reality, in my view, is that if it comes to a question of our own security, we have the ability and will to defend ourselves. It is a question of how much we do to help somebody else defend themselves.
And how much we understand that defending Ukraine means to defend themselves, ourselves.
Ourselves. We don't largely at the moment. I believe that firmly, but I don't know that our societies really get that. But when you meet with people and talk with them, and I do this a lot in the US, and you explain in terms that they can relate to. And in the United States, I make a parallel of the American Revolution, is that we were fighting a bigger, wealthier, well-armed adversary. We were just fighting to defend our homelands. It took time. We had a lot of losses. It was difficult. And we had assistance from a major foreign power, France. And with that, we actually were able to prevail and get the British to stop the war. And that's a very similar circumstance to the Ukrainians fighting for their freedom, just as we fought for ours.
Mr. Volker, thank you for your interview.
Thank you.